Conclusions. Castoriadis' early years in Greece were of particular importance for his intellectual itinerary and later theoretical development. His evolution reflects a series of social and politico-historical transformations that occurred in Greece from 1936 to 1945. He came from a bourgeois class background and obtained a considerable and multilingual education based on both ancient Greek and Marxist philosophy. His first philosophical concerns, his involvement in the theory and practice of Marxism, and his interest in the thought of Max Weber could be traced to these early years in Greece. Castoriadis experienced the Greek fascist regime of Metaxas. I don't know if I'm spelling the name right. Metaxas. Please correct me if you know more about Greek history than I do. And the Nazi occupation of Greece, 1941 to 1944, the bloody events of the armed conflict of December 1944, which were the prelude to the Greek Civil War of 1946 to 1949, as well as the British armed intervention. During this period, as a young Trotskyist, he participated in the theoretical debates promoted by the minor Trotskyist groups and got a very... One second. During this period, as a young Marxist, he participated in the theoretical debates promoted by the minor Trotskyist groups and got a very strong flavor of the codified and mechanistic Marxism of the Greek communist movement. His encounter with the dogmatism of the orthodox Marxist tradition was coupled with his traumatic experience of being persecuted and at risk of being assassinated by the Stalinists of the Greek Communist Party. In the end, he migrated to France to keep himself alive and continue his personal and intellectual journey. His move could be seen as part of the last and most distinctive intellectual migration, which took place before and after the Second World War. Arriving in France, he had to deal with the dominance of the Stalinist intellectuals and the influence of the French Communist Party, and he felt the theoretical and political inadequacy of French Trotskyism. This part of the French intellectual and political setting could be seen as a continuity of the experience of orthodox Marxism that he had experienced in Greece. On the other hand, he came across the developing intellectual ferment that emerged in post-war France and opened himself up to other radical influences and theoretical currents. It was the beginning of a new period marked by the renaissance of Hegel's thought and the return to Marx's writings, principally to the newly discovered, quote, young Marx, end quote. This intellectual journey was associated with Socialisme ou Barbarie group and journal, in which he started publishing his theoretical contributions. On this basis, his early years in Greece, the existential incident of his migration, and the intellectual milieu in France decisively formed his intellectual idiosyncrasy and were reflected in his later theoretical contribution. More specifically, all of these life and intellectual influences found expression in the particular ways he attempted to interpret and criticize Marxism and Marxism thought, the decline of the labor movement and the crisis of Marxism, the question regarding the class character of the Soviet-type societies, and the role of bureaucracy needed more careful and sufficient consideration from Castoriadis' perspective. For Castoriadis, it was a crisis that called for the eradication of all mystifications, the critique of the social relations that produced and at the same time reduced Marxism to a mere ideology. This process of demystification brings to the fore old questions addressed in a new way, eliminates presuppositions, and attacks everything that conceals the truth. The failure in crisis called everything into question. As Karl Kosik argued, quote, in every crisis, everything is again theoretically examined and analyzed, and things that once seemed to be resolved and clear have long ceased to be obvious and appear problematical. That is, as vital questions that must forever and always be examined and analyzed, end quote. And this is, according to Axelos, the significance of thought, quote, calling everything in question and keeping the question open, end quote. Several questions arise from the function of questioning thought, which sought not to reconcile itself with the so-called, quote, Marxist social reality, end quote, not to base itself on assumptions and presuppositions and to take nothing for granted. In this case, Castoriadis' critical thinking was directed against the established mode of thought, against what was prevalent and what presented itself as natural, certain, and absolute. but what used to be prevalent in the labor and radical movement and came under fierce criticism by Castoriadis. The prevalence of orthodox Marxism in all of its dimensions, its decay into simple ideology, a closed system, a dogma that was used to legitimate both social democratic and Soviet-type regimes, the stagnation of theory, and the emasculation of practical struggles were called into radical question. The historical realization of different, quote, Marxist trends, end quote, such as Leninism, Marxism-Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, and social democracy, or the political and historical course of others, Trotskyism, implied the questioning of theory's validity. It also entails the need for the reemergence of critical theory, since, quote, more elements of the theory become reality, end quote, It also entails the need for the reemergence of critical theory, since, quote, the more elements of the theory become reality, end quote, according to Marcuse, quote, the more urgent becomes the question of what the theory intended as its goal, end quote. The consequence for Castoriadis' dealing with orthodox Marxism in this way was to bring to the surface the postulation of the unity of theory and practice. For Castoriadis, the crisis, inconsistencies and contradictions in orthodox Marxist thought could not be overcome separately from the social reality of orthodox Marxism. A simple theoretical reflection upon the crisis of Marxism was unable to reveal the new possibilities that stand before critical theory for the reunity of thought and action. From this vantage point, Castoriadis endeavored to explicate the various aspects of Marxist reality and practice and to find their origins. Was not the identification of orthodox Marxism with the revolutionary movement a mystification? Why should we take as natural and for granted the prevalent position and hegemony of Marxism in it? To what extent was Marxism responsible for the decay of the labor movement? Why was Marxism reduced to, quote, state ideology, end quote, and, quote, reformist practice, end quote? Running through Castoriadis' political thought are two fundamental notions and one major aim. The concepts of, quote, crisis and, quote, critique constitute the conceptual pillars upon which his critical theory is premised, and this is expounded with a view to critically examining and reevaluating the theoretical and practical history of the working class and anti-capitalist movement. Castoriadis' undertaking started as an imminent critique of orthodox Marxism, which could be seen as his attempt to defend Marx from orthodoxy. By criticizing Trotsky's ideas and contrasting them with those of Marx, he made a pioneering and remarkable effort to demystify the actual class character of the USSR. His intellectual endeavor led him not only to question Lenin and Leninism, but also to seek Marx's responsibility for this metamorphosis of orthodox Marxism and its reactionary function. Castoriadis was led to question the foundations of Marxism, that is, he critically confronted the Marxian theory itself and correspondingly the foundations of Marx's thought as well. Marx had to lose any sacred aura, and any religious attitude towards him had to be castigated. During the Cold War anti-communist hysteria, Castoriadis considered the crisis of Marxism as a crisis of Marx's original thought as well. He probed Marx's writings with many penetrating questions in an attempt to explore the metaphysical presuppositions and positivistic elements of Marx's thought. Castoriadis' passage from Marxism to Marx prompted a reappreciation of fundamental critical concepts and theoretical categories. For the Greek scholar, the crisis and degeneration of both Bolshevik and social democratic regimes and organizations could not be explained by making, quote, repairs at least cost, end quote, in Marxist theory or adapting a theological attitude toward Marx. As Castoriadis put it, one can no longer talk about Marxism without taking into account its actual history, as Marx taught that, quote, an ideology is not to be judged by the words it employs, but by what it becomes in social reality, end quote. According to Karl Korsch, quote, the first step in reestablishing a revolutionary theory and practice consists in breaking with the monopolistic claim of Marxism to revolutionary initiative and to theoretical and practical leadership, end quote. In this sense, Castoriadis contributed enormously to the critique of traditional Marxism in all its versions. His theorizing has been instrumental in elucidating the crisis of orthodox Marxism in all of its varieties, from Marxism-Leninism to structuralist Marxism. His analyses flew in the face of established and dogmatic ideas and practices that were dominant within the left, broadly conceived throughout the last century, and they are still alive in the contemporary anti-capitalist movement. He also raised intriguing questions with respect to the nature, origins, and genesis of the bureaucratic and authoritarian regimes of Eastern Europe. There is a neglected legacy of Castoriadis' critique of traditional Marxism, which could constitute the basis for further discussion and development. Also, he inspired scholars, political groups, and theoretical currents. For example, E.P. Thompson in The Poverty of Theory drew on his argument in order to criticize Althusser's structural Marxism. Castoriadis' emphasis on the working class's autonomous struggles also had a considerable impact on the, quote, workers' autonomy, end quote, autonomia operaia movement in Italy between the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s. Further, his positions had a significant influence on the British Solidarity Group. I have a lot of those essays on this channel by Maurice Brinton, if you're interested, as well as minor, quote, councilist groups in Germany and Holland. Castoriadis chose not to set Marx against the, quote, Marxist ideology, end quote, with a view to exposing the roots of this ideology and exploring its foundations, but also followed the opposite direction. He made an effort to reread, rethink, and question Marx through the theory and tradition of Marxism. He decided to investigate the grounds on which Marxist thought was reduced into a reformist, social democratic, and established Bolshevism ideology, and search for Marx's own responsibility. The first problem of a theoretical and political nature is that he neglected the tradition of critical Marxism and other critical readings and interpretations of Marx. Most important of all, the fact that Castoriadis' thought continues to be an insightful critique of orthodox Marxism should not let us lose sight of the way in which he confronted Marxist thought. He did shed light on Marx's positivist elements, addressed questions with which subsequent scholars, theoretical currents, and political groups tackled more profoundly and extensively. Yet, though he rejected the logic of orthodox Marxism, he espoused its logic in the manner in which he understood Marx. In many cases, he read Marx through the prism of orthodox Marxism, e.g., the base superstructure model, and came to the point of identifying Marx with orthodox Marxist interpretations. This approach, of course, was not irrelevant to his pronouncement about the end of Marxism and his declared verdict for the necessity of going beyond Marxism and Marx. This stance implied his intention to go beyond the Marxian categories and more specifically to go, quote, beyond, quote, class thinking, end quote, end quote. More emphasis was placed upon the political and ideological elements of society, mostly at the expense of an analysis of human social relations. In his analysis of social and political phenomenon, class relations were reduced to power relations. This is a matter of great importance. More emphasis was placed upon the political and ideological elements of society, mostly at the expense of an analysis of human social relations. In his analysis of social and political phenomenon, class relations were reduced to power relations. This is a matter of great importance for Castoriadis' later theoretical development, for it involved his breaking away from the core issues and conceptual tools of critical theory. It marked a new departure in his intellectual course, which in many cases was expressed in views and positions that were not always compatible with radical theory and the anti-capitalist tradition. Castoriadis tended to forget the fundamental distinction between Marx and Marxism, or traditional and critical Marxism. He announced the death of Marxism, and at the same time he did not always make explicit the theoretical and political implications of his critique. He posed a question to structuralist thinkers with respect to their stance towards May 1968 that could be addressed with equal force to his treatment of critical Marxism and Marx. Quote, "What then is the status of your discourse?" End quote. What was the purpose of Castoriadis' critique, at times justified and at times unsubstantiated and unfortunate? What about the useful elements in Marx? In a revolutionary sense, and the tradition of various Marxism, especially critical Marxism. Castoriadis left his discussion of Marxism, and the regimes of Eastern Europe and the history of the working class movement open to being misunderstood, falsified, and misused. At stake here is the manner in which Castoriadis has been received and read and used by both the critical, radical, and anti-capitalist tradition and the existing social and theoretical order, the quote, intellectual establishment. For a large part of the traditional left and the various Marxist currents, Castoriadis' contribution remained unknown and was dogmatically, unwisely, and crudely seen as, quote, reactionary, end quote. On the other hand, and more specifically during the 1970s, an attempt was made by the, quote, new philosophers, end quote, the, quote, new philosophers, such as Bernard-Henri Levy, and André Glucksmann, etc., to misuse and misappropriate Castoriadis' critique of the Soviet system, Marxism, and Marx. The, quote, new philosophers revived interest in the term, quote, totalitarianism, but they attribute it to a completely different meaning. They contributed to it a completely different meaning than the Greek intellectual used. Castoriadis being used, the Greek intellectual. Castoriadis' critique of Marx and Marxism was also understood as being compatible with the postmodernist views that discard the grand narratives and champion today's model of, quote, representative democracy, end quote. He not only rejected the, quote, new wave of diversionists, end quote, the, quote, new philosophers, end quote, approach, but also reacted against the misuse and distortion of his own ideas. For Castoriadis, it is explicit that the function of the, quote, new philosophers, quote, fully plays into the interests of the apparatuses, end quote, with a view to, quote, covering over in advance the true questions by, quote, answers, end quote, which have their effect and their function to stop dead in its tracks the movement of reflection, and to take the edge off the political and revolutionary critique of totalitarianism on the one hand, of Marxism on the other, end quote. And Castoriadis goes on with his forceful critique, quote, the new wave of diversionists does not ask, how is totalitarianism actually engendered? Shamelessly pillaging through what a few of us have been working out for the past 30 years, it hastily lifts from this work a few elements whose meaning it distorts in order to say totalitarianism is Marx, is Hegel, is Fichte, is Plato. It understands neither what thinking means, nor the unfathomable relationship historical thought and historical reality entertain. Diverting the critique of Marx that we had made from a political, practical, revolutionary perspective, a critique that was bringing out precisely the capitalist Western metaphysical heritage of which Marx had remained prisoner, to discover thereby what in Marx remained on the hither side of a revolutionary aim, it tries to draw from this critique the following absurd conclusion. It is precisely as a revolutionary that Marx would have engendered the Gulag, end quote. Castoriadis. After the, quote, nouveau philosophies, and, or maybe it's nouveau philosophie, and over the last 30 years, the work of Castoriadis was subjected to a ruthless and peculiar academization and canonization. There have been repeated attempts to use it to serve the existing reality of the capitalist society. Castoriadis is presented as the theoretician of the modern political imaginary, of post-Marxism, of social creativity, of psychoanalysis, or of democracy and autonomy deprived of both the radical and critical meaning that Castoriadis attributed to them. There is no reference to the early and more radical Castoriadis, to the man as a critique of orthodox Marxism, or to his critique of Marx that echoes the left and radical assessments of the latter. Not surprisingly, these aspects of Castoriadis' work have been nearly neglected or presented to show that he rejected Marx in favor of democracy. This abstract and apolitical reading of Castoriadis led to the loss of the anti-capitalist dimension of his thought, to a, quote, fashionable, end quote, misappropriation of his later philosophical writings at the expense of his, quote, political, practical, revolutionary perspective, end quote. Once again, after the 1970s, Castoriadis' political and revolutionary critique of totalitarianism, Marxism, and Marx is distorted by the, quote, new wave of diversionists, end quote, and new Stalinists of anti-Marx, anti-Marxism, and anti-communism are produced among his adherents. Unfortunately, Castoriadis himself opened the door to this misappropriation of his ideas. Inherent contradictions and limits of his thought were pushed to the more conservative and apolitical extreme by the academic and intellectual apparatuses. He countered with the distortion of his critical project, though belatedly and unsuccessfully, and attempted to champion the radicalism of his theoretical endeavor, as Castoriadis vigorously reminds us. Quote, the workers' movement began well before Marx, and it had nothing to do with Fichte or with Hegel. The question posed is not how to, quote, replace Marxism, end quote, but how to create a new relationship between thinking and doing, how to elucidate things in terms of a practical project without falling back either into the system or into doing just anything, end quote. Castoriadis. In his attempt to search for a new relationship between critical theory and radical praxis, Castoriadis articulated his practical project in and through a parallel critique of the crisis of modern capitalist societies. Having as a reference point his analysis of the movements of the 1960s and principally his critical examination of the revolutionary crisis of May 1968, he was powerfully engaged in developing an insightful understanding of the decay of Western contemporary societies. The most important aspect of his critique lies in the fact that he searched for the genesis of the crisis in the social contradictions of the capitalist society. He also went beyond a mere economic interpretation of the crisis and perceived the crisis as a permanent and generalized crisis, which has corroded the social, political, cultural, and anthropological foundations of modern societies. By reevaluating this decay critically, he made it explicit that the crisis cannot be overcome without a radical transformation of the dominant economic and political model. There is thus a common thread running through Castoriadis' critical theory from the crisis and critique of Marxism and Marx to the crisis and critique of totalitarianism to the crisis and critique of modern capitalist societies. Castoriadis supplies us with an extensive and multilateral analysis of the complex issues of the crisis of modernity, revealing at the same time the contradictory and controversial nature of his argumentation and way of thinking. Two antithetical and opposed currents of thought can be identified in his theorizing. The first tendency, with all of its own limitations, emphasizes the role of social struggle and antagonism as a major factor for creating the crisis, and grasp the crisis as a product of the social contradictions immanent in bureaucratic and capitalist societies. Concomitantly, he stresses the role of subjectivity and revolutionary praxis of the people as a means of transcending the crisis in the direction of creating an alternative to capitalist society. The second current of Castoriadis' thought focuses attention upon the explication of crisis via the construction of a paradigmatic approach by espousing and applying an ideal typical model or norm, or by establishing his own periodization of Western European history based upon his project of autonomy. This deficiency was connected with his Weberian influences and could explain why he failed to grasp the complexity and moving contradictions of the social systems under consideration in reproduced abstractions and generalizations. In his essay entitled Recommencing the Revolution, Castoriadis suggested that, quote, everything must be started over again, but starting from the immense experience of a century of working-class struggles, end quote. However, one could ask Castoriadis, why start only from the practical experiences of the working-class struggles and neglect the theoretical ones? Are we not slipping into metaphysics when we separate the theory and the practice of the class struggle? And further, as Ernst Bloch reminds us, quote, a new good is never completely new. Most of the past is interrupted future, future in the past, end quote. The Greek scholar attacked the nihilism of the spirit and at the same time seems to adopt a nihilist stance towards Marx's thought and the Marxist tradition. But do Marx and critical Marxism not form one of the fundamental bases for any future development of critical and radical theory? As Karol Kosik aptly pointed out, quote, anything without a foundation is unstable, shallow, and empty, end quote. By losing our foundations, we, quote, overcome by nothingness, end quote, and, quote, nothingness means nihil, or nihil, Nihil, as in nihilism. Castoriadis himself was well aware of this when he made the point that, quote, the movement must maintain and enlarge its openness as far as possible. Openness, however, is not and can never be absolute openness. Absolute openness is nothingness, that is to say, it is immediately absolute closure. The argument of this study is that Castoriadis' thought can enormously enrich the tradition of critical and radical theory. His heated debates, disputes, and critical confrontations with other political theorists, scholars, and philosophers could constitute a reference point for reinforcing and strengthening the radical currents in social and political thought. Furthermore, his critique could promote discussion regarding the achievements and failures of radical anti-capitalist theory and practice. We turn to him not only to find affirmative answers to our questions, but to pick up and develop the valuable and challenging questions bequeathed. 1 second. Fucking the last paragraph. I gotta get interrupted. Okay. Where the fuck am I? Furthermore, his critique could promote discussion regarding the achievements and failures of radical anti-capitalist theory and practice. We turn to him not only to find affirmative answers to our questions, but to pick up and develop the valuable and challenging questions bequeathed to us by him. His analysis of the Hungarian uprising of 1956 and the events of May 1968 could provide us with invaluable lessons which have wider resonances for the study and understanding of contemporary social movements. In the same vein, Castoriadis' comprehensive exploration of the crisis of modern society supplies us with thoughtful and sound insights into a much more profound understanding of its origins and generalized character. Most significantly, his scholarly work is highly political, and his critical theory is never disassociated from political and social reality. It never remained on the sidelines. It was developed as a thorough critique of all authoritarian forms of social and political organization and paved the way for the search for radical alternatives to capitalism. His ideas about socialism, autonomy, revolution, and the creation of a new society based upon direct democracy and the democracy of councils runs throughout his entire political thought. The most important issue for critical political theory and radical political praxis, then, is to keep the questions addressed by Castoriadis open as an enduring source of problems and a continuous struggle against the dogmas and the closure of practical critical activity. All right,